I found him shivering behind a dumpster at 2 a.m., soaked in rain with nothing but torn clothes. I brought him home, gave him shelter, food, and hope. But after his first shower, everything changed. What I discovered would shake me to my core and change both our lives forever. Before we dive into this incredible story, hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell. Trust me, you won't want to miss stories like this. And stick around until the end. What happens next will blow your mind. It was a Tuesday night in November, and I was making one of those late-night runs to the convenience store that you always regret but somehow keep doing anyway. You know the feeling, when you're craving something specific, and your brain convinces you that driving 15 minutes at 2 a.m. for a bag of chips is totally reasonable. The rain was coming down in sheets, the kind of downpour that makes you question every life choice that led you to be outside at that moment. I parked behind the store because the front spots were flooded, and that's when I heard it. A soft coughing sound coming from near the dumpsters. At first, I thought it might be a stray cat, or maybe just my imagination playing tricks on me. But as I walked closer, squinting through the rain, I saw him. There was a man crouched behind the large green dumpster, trying to use a piece of cardboard as shelter from the rain. He couldn't have been more than 30 years old, with dark hair plastered to his head and clothes that looked like they hadn't been changed in weeks. His shoes were falling apart, and I could see his feet through the holes. He was shivering so violently that I could hear his teeth chattering from where I stood. For a moment, I just stood there, frozen. Part of me wanted to pretend I hadn't seen anything, grab my snacks, and go home to my warm apartment. I mean, what was I supposed to do? I didn't know this person. He could be dangerous, he could be on drugs, he could be mentally unstable. All the warnings my parents had drilled into me about stranger danger came flooding back. But then he looked up at me and our eyes met. I've never forgotten that look. It wasn't aggressive or threatening. It was just pure desperation mixed with embarrassment. Like he wanted to disappear but had nowhere to go. He quickly looked away and tried to make himself smaller behind the dumpster, as if he could somehow become invisible. "Hey," I called out, taking a step closer. "Are you okay?" He didn't answer at first, just kept his head down. The rain was getting heavier, and I could see him trying to pull his thin jacket tighter around his body. It was clearly doing nothing to keep him warm or dry. "I'm fine," he finally said, his voice barely audible over the rain, just waiting for it to stop. I knew that was a lie. The weather report had said this storm would last all night. He was going to be out there for hours in those conditions. I looked at him again, really looked at him, and despite all my reservations, I couldn't just walk away. "What's your name?" I asked. He hesitated for a long moment before answering. "Jake." "Jake, I'm Tom. Listen, this rain isn't going to stop anytime soon. Do you have somewhere to go?" He shook his head, still not making eye contact. I could tell he was trying hard to maintain what little dignity he had left. The whole situation was heartbreaking, and I found myself making a decision that would change both of our lives. "Look, I have a couch at my place. It's warm, it's dry, and you can stay there tonight if you want. No strings attached." Jake's head snapped up, and for the first time, he really looked at me. There was suspicion in his eyes, which I couldn't blame him for. A stranger offering help in the middle of the night probably seemed too good to be true. "I don't need charity," he said quietly. "It's not charity. It's just basic human decency. Nobody should have to sleep outside in weather like this." We stared at each other for what felt like an eternity. I could see him weighing his options, pride battling against necessity. Finally, the cold and rain won out. "Just for tonight," he said, struggling to stand up. His legs were so stiff from the cold that he nearly fell over. The drive back to my apartment was awkward, to say the least. Jake sat in the passenger seat, dripping water everywhere, trying to make himself as small as possible. I had the heat cranked up, but he was still shivering. I tried to make small talk, asking where he was from and how he'd ended up in that situation, but his answers were short and vague. "I lost my job a few months ago," he explained. "Couldn't make rent. Been staying wherever I can since then." It was a story I'd heard before, unfortunately. The economy was tough, and it didn't take much for someone to fall through the cracks. I felt guilty about all the assumptions I'd made when I first saw him. When we got to my apartment, I showed him to the bathroom and gave him a towel. Then I made up the couch with some blankets and pillows. It wasn't much, but it was infinitely better than a cardboard box behind a dumpster. "There's leftover pizza in the fridge if you're hungry," I told him. "Help yourself to whatever you need." Jake just nodded, still looking uncomfortable about accepting help. I could tell he wasn't used to people being kind to him, which made me even more glad I'd made the decision to bring him home. The next morning, I woke up to the smell of coffee. I found Jake in the kitchen, having made a pot for both of us. He'd folded the blankets neatly on the couch and was sitting at my small dining table, staring out the window. "Thank you," he said when he saw me. "I haven't slept that well in months." Over the next few days, what was supposed to be a one-night arrangement turned into something longer. Jake was polite, helpful, and surprisingly good company. He insisted on doing chores around the apartment to earn his keep, and he was an excellent cook. He told me more about his background, how he'd worked in construction before the company went under, how he'd tried to find other work but kept getting turned down, how his savings had run out faster than he'd expected. I started to genuinely enjoy having him around. My apartment had always felt a little too quiet for just me, and Jake had this way of making everything feel more alive. He had a great sense of humor once he relaxed, and we'd stay up late talking about everything from sports to philosophy. He was clearly intelligent and well-read, which made his situation even more tragic. But there were little things that didn't quite add up. Sometimes he'd mention places he'd been, or things he'd done that seemed inconsistent with someone who'd been struggling financially for months. He had knowledge about expensive wines and could discuss art history in detail. When I'd ask him about it, he'd just shrug and say he'd learned things from various jobs over the years. One day, I noticed his hands. They were calloused, which fit with his construction worker story, but his fingernails were perfectly manicured. When I mentioned it, he said he'd just gotten into the habit of taking care of them. It seemed like a strange priority for someone living on the streets, but I didn't push it. Another time, I caught him on my computer researching stock prices. When I asked him about it, he said he was just curious about how his old company was doing. But the way he navigated the financial websites suggested he knew a lot more about investing than he'd let on. I started to feel like Jake was holding something back, but I couldn't figure out what it could be. He was always honest about other things, and he never asked me for money or anything beyond basic shelter. If he was running some kind of scam, it was the longest and least profitable one in history. About 2 weeks after I'd found him, Jake finally agreed to take a proper shower. He'd been using the bathroom to wash up, but he'd avoided the shower, claiming he didn't want to use too much hot water. I'd been encouraging him to really get clean, especially since I'd noticed he always seemed to smell faintly of expensive cologne, which was another one of those little inconsistencies that nagged at me. While he was in the bathroom, I decided to throw his old clothes in the washing machine. They were the same ones he'd been wearing that first night, and despite his daily washing routine, they desperately needed a deep clean. As I was gathering them up from the bathroom floor, something fell out of his jacket pocket. It was a wallet, a very expensive-looking leather wallet that definitely didn't match the story of a broke construction worker. My hands were shaking as I picked it up. I knew I shouldn't look inside. It was a violation of his privacy, but something compelled me to open it. Inside, there were several credit cards, all with the name Jackson Worthington III on them. Not Jake, Jackson Worthington III. There was also a driver's license with Jake's photo, but showing the same name, and an address in one of the most exclusive neighborhoods in the city. Behind the license was a black American Express card and what looked like a membership card for a private country club. But that wasn't the most shocking part. Tucked behind everything else was a folded piece of paper. When I opened it, my heart nearly stopped. It was a bank statement showing a balance of over $2 million. I sat on my bed, staring at the papers in my hands, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. The man I'd found behind a dumpster, the man I'd been feeding and housing out of pity, was apparently a millionaire. Nothing made sense and some. The shower was still running, so I had time to process what I'd discovered. Was this some kind of elaborate joke? Was I being pranked? Was Jake, or Jackson, some kind of socialite doing research for a book or documentary? Was he mentally ill and didn't realize he had access to all this money? Or was there something darker going on? Was he hiding from someone? Was the money stolen? Was he in some kind of trouble that made it dangerous for him to go home? My mind was racing with possibilities, none of them good. I carefully put everything back in the wallet exactly as I'd found it and placed it back in his jacket pocket. Then I sat on my couch and tried to figure out what to say when he came out of the bathroom. 20 minutes later, Jake emerged from the shower looking like a completely different person. Without the grime and the raggedy clothes, he looked like he could step onto the cover of a magazine. His hair was actually a rich brown color, not the dirty mess I'd thought it was. His skin was clear and healthy looking. Even his posture was different, more confident, more refined. "Feeling better?" I asked, trying to keep my voice normal. "Much better, thanks," he said, settling onto the couch next to me. "I can't thank you enough for everything you've done for me, Tom. You probably saved my life that night." I looked at him, really looked at him, and realized I'd been an idiot. Everything about him screamed money and privilege. The way he spoke, the way he carried himself, even the way he ate. How had I missed it? "Jake," I said carefully, "can I ask you something?" "Of course." "What's your real name?" The color drained from his face. For a moment, he looked like he might try to keep up the charade, but then his shoulders slumped in defeat. "Jackson," he said quietly. "Jackson Worthington." "And you're not really homeless, are you?" He was quiet for a long time, staring at his hands. When he finally looked up at me, there were tears in his eyes. "No," he admitted. "I'm not homeless. I'm sorry, Tom. I'm so sorry for lying to you." "Then why?" I asked. "Why were you behind that dumpster? Why the elaborate story about losing your job?" Jackson took a deep breath and started talking. The real story was more heartbreaking than anything he'd told me before. He came from one of the wealthiest families in the state. His father owned a chain of luxury hotels, and Jackson had been groomed from birth to take over the business. He'd gone to the best schools, had every opportunity handed to him, but he'd never felt like his life was his own. Every decision was made for him. Every relationship was scrutinized. Every moment was scheduled and managed. 3 months earlier, he'd been engaged to a woman his parents had chosen for him. She was from another wealthy family, and the marriage was more of a business merger than a love story. The night before the engagement party, Jackson had finally reached his breaking point. I realized I'd never made a single real decision in my entire life, he explained. I didn't know who I was outside of being Jackson Worthington III. I didn't know if anyone had ever liked me or just for my money. I felt like I was suffocating. So he'd run away. He'd taken some cash, left his credit cards and identification behind, and decided to see what life was like for people who had to make it on their own. He'd been living on the streets for weeks, trying to understand what real struggle felt like. "But that night you found me, I was at the end of my rope," he continued. I was cold, hungry, and scared. I realized I'd been playing at poverty while real people were suffering. I felt like a fraud. So you decided to lie to me instead. I was ashamed, he said. When you helped me without knowing who I was or what I had, it was the first time in my life someone had shown me genuine kindness with no ulterior motive. I didn't want to ruin that by telling you I was rich. I wanted to know what it felt like to be cared about for who I am, not what I have. I sat there processing everything he'd told me. Part of me was angry about being lied to, but a bigger part of me understood why he'd done it. In a weird way, his deception had given both of us something we needed. "So what happens now?" I asked. Jackson was quiet for a moment. "I need to go back," he said. "I can't keep running from my life, but these past 2 weeks with you have been the most real I've ever felt. You treated me like family, Tom. You showed me what genuine friendship looks like." Over the next few hours, we talked about everything. Jackson told me more about his real life, his family's expectations, and his fears about returning to a world where he felt trapped. I told him about my own struggles with loneliness and purpose, and how having him around had made me feel like I was making a difference in someone's life. When it came time for him to leave, Jackson tried to give me money to thank me for everything I'd done. I refused, of course. That wasn't why I'd helped him, and accepting payment would have cheapened the whole experience. But Jackson was determined to show his gratitude. Instead of cash, he set up a scholarship fund in my name for people who were transitioning out of homelessness. He also started volunteering at local shelters, using his real-world experience to help others in ways that his privileged upbringing never could have taught him. As for his family situation, Jackson did return home, but on his own terms. He broke off the engagement and started making his own decisions about his life and career. His parents weren't happy, but they couldn't argue with the positive changes they saw in him. We stayed in touch, and our friendship remained strong. In fact, it got stronger because it was finally based on complete honesty. Jackson would sometimes joke that I was the only person in his life who'd seen him at his absolute worst and still wanted to be his friend. The experience taught me something important about helping others. Sometimes the people who need help the most aren't who you expect them to be. Jackson didn't need my money or my pity, but he desperately needed human connection and acceptance. By treating him with basic kindness and dignity, I'd given him something more valuable than any amount of wealth could buy. It also made me realize that everyone is fighting battles we can't see. Jackson had every material comfort in the world, but he was drowning in loneliness and expectations. His wealth hadn't protected him from pain, it had just created different kinds of problems. Looking back, I'm glad I made the decision to help that night, even though it turned out to be completely different from what I thought I was signing up for. Sometimes the best thing you can do for someone is simply treat them like a human being worth caring about. You never know what kind of difference that might make in their life, or in your own. If this story moved you, please give it a thumbs up and share it with someone who needs to hear it. Have you ever helped a stranger? Tell me your story in the comments below. Don't forget to subscribe for more real-life stories that will make you think. And remember, sometimes the people who need help the most are hiding the biggest secrets. Until next time, keep your hearts open but your eyes wide.